standing from here, this is just a wonderful sight. So I appreciate all of you coming and making this event happen this morning so that we can mark Undoing Racism Day. I want to acknowledge a number of distinguished guests who are here this morning, and this is not in any particular order, except for the first. I wanted to recognize Linda Litwin, who is a trustee of the Harmony for Peace Foundation. I don't know if Linda's arrived yet, but as I mention each person's name, if you could just stand up for a moment. It turns out that September 21st is International Peace Day. We talked about when they joined the steering committee, why was our event on September 21st? It turned out to be a wonderful coincidence. So today is also International Peace Day, so I wanted to make note of that. Doug Blasey is the president-elect of the Rotary Club of Wayne. If you could just stand up for a second. Reverend Carlos Bounds is the pastor of Bethel AME Church here in Bryn Mawr. Superintendent Chief of Police William Colarulo is here from Radnor Township. Thank you for coming. Bob DiMicantonio is a trustee of the Wayne Business Association. Reverend Joseph DiPaolo is the senior pastor at Wayne United Methodist Church. Commissioner John Fisher, the president of the Board of Commissioners and commissioner of the 7th Ward. Captain Gerald Hale from Valley Forge Military Academy. Chris Kowalski is the assistant to the president of Villanova University. Reverend Joel McDuffie is the pastor at the AME Church in Wayne. Kathy Mulroy is the director of the Radnor Memorial Library. Commissioner John Nagel is the 5th Ward Commissioner in Radnor. Father Joe Nayrog is the pastor of St. Thomas of Villanova Church. Commissioner Elaine Fisher is the commissioner from the 4th Ward in Radnor Township. Elaine Schaefer. Elaine's my commissioner too. Principal Mark Schellinger is the principal of the Radnor High School. Principal Anthony Stevenson is the principal of the Radnor Middle School, and he has brought with him today the student council of the middle school, which is 7th graders and 8th graders, so we welcome those kids this morning. Representative Greg Vitale. Choir Director Carolyn Vance from the Bethel AME Church will be leading the choir this morning. Representative Bill Adolph. Good morning. Father Carl Janicki from Cabrini College. Reverend Howard Childs from Second Baptist Church. And Deaconess Peggy Martin from the First Baptist Church in Wayne. So thank you all very much for coming this morning. And yes, Rabbi Marshall Portnoy from Mainline Reformed Temple will be on the program this morning. Thank you. I said Greg. At this point, I'd like to turn the program over to Beth Hassel, who is from Villanova University, and she'll be giving the welcome.
Thank you, Ann. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here in many, many ways. I attended the breakfast many, many years consecutively, and it's been wonderful. But on behalf of Father Peter Donahue, our president, and the entire university community, I am honored to welcome all of you here today as we commit ourselves to Undoing Racism Day. The words Unitas, Veritas, Caritas, which are in our seal, states clearly that our community here strives for this unity as we search for truth in the context of a loving community. So this morning, as we gather to promote unity and friendship, we want to just get to know one another as we do that. So we as a university commit ourselves to embracing the differences. We commit ourselves to unity in the complexity of diversity. A very warm welcome.
I'd like to welcome Cantor Marshall Portnoy from Mainline Reformed Temple to give the invocation.
Good morning, everyone. I bring greetings from the Jewish community in general, specifically from Mainline Reformed Temple in Wynwood, Pennsylvania, and our spiritual leader, Rabbi David Strauss. Now, I don't know too much about a lot of things, but one thing that I always know, there's always a Jewish holiday around the corner. This is no exception, because next week we celebrate our New Year. Now, we Jews are sort of a strange people. We write and read from right to left, and we have 4 New Years. We even have a New Year for the trees, and we have a New Year for the crops, the harvest. And we have our legal New Year, which begins in our month of Nisan, in which we celebrate Passover. And curiously enough, the New Year that everybody knows about, Rosh Hashanah, which occurs next Wednesday night, oh, that's another thing. Our holidays always begin the day before. Occurs in the 7th month of the year, rather than in the 1st month of the year. But it's on this holiday, which is sort of the beginning of the popular year, when we all sort of get back to school, get back to work. Fall is in the air, it's September, sometimes October. You never know quite when the Jewish holidays are going to come. We say these words. Yehi ratzon milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'elokei avotenu, shetchadesh aleinu shana tova u'metuka. May it be your will, O Lord, that we be sealed up in the book of life for a year that is sweet and good and blessed. And in that spirit, I offer you these words from our liturgy. God bless this house. God bless this place. And keep us safe in your embrace. God bless the dark, God bless the light, God bless us all, by day and night. May our days be fulfilled for good. May we answer when God calls. May the work of our hands show that we know that this house, that God's house, has no walls. God bless this house. God bless this place. May all who come within this space go forth in joy, go forth in peace. God bless them all in time to come. God bless this house. Shana Tova, Happy New Year. God bless you.
And now I invite Commissioner John Fisher to come up and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Good morning. Before we start the Pledge of Allegiance, I want to acknowledge a few people that had made this breakfast possible for 8 years in a row. I want to thank Commissioner Hank Mahoney and Commissioner Lisa Paolino, And most importantly, I want to thank Nikki Plum, who's here today, who was very much involved in having this breakfast. And unfortunately, the breakfast fell victim to the down economy. But the people in this room, the members of the committee, and Nikki, and Ann Minicozy worked hard to pull this back together and get this breakfast going again. And I want to thank all of you for doing this and all of you for coming today. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Now I'm very happy to announce that the choir will be singing I Need You to Survive. And this is Carolyn Vance and the Unity Choir. And very much been looking forward to this. And then after this song, we'll be directed to the buffet and then go into the rest of the program. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. You might like to join us. The words are on your sheet, your paper, your program. When we get to the last part, I'll pray for you. You pray for me. You might like to take in. Reverend Atkins is going to lead us, and I need you to start.
I need you, and you need me. We're all a part of God's body. Stand with me. Agree with me. We're all a part of God's body. It is His will that every need be supplied. You're important to me. I need you to survive. You are important to me. I need you to survive. I need
an adaptation, some excerpts from the book If the World Were a Village.
Good morning. What I will read to you are excerpts from the book, If the World Were a Village, a book about the world's people, written by David J. Smith and illustrated by Sheila Armstrong. Earth is a crowded place, and is getting more crowded all the time. As of January 1st, 2002, the world's population was 6,200,000,000. 23 countries have more than 50 million people. 10 countries have more than 100 million people. China has nearly 1,300,000,000. Numbers this big are hard to understand, but what if we imagine the whole population of the world as a village of 100 people? In this imaginary village, each person would represent 62 million people from the real world. By learning about these 100 villagers, who they are and how they live, perhaps we can find out more about our neighbors in the real world and the problems our planet may face in the future. Come and meet the people of the global village. Where do the people of global village come from? Of the 100 people in the global village, 61 are from Asia, 13 are from Africa, 12 are from Europe, 8 are from South America, Central America, including Mexico and the Caribbean. 5 are from Canada and the United States. 1 is from Oceania, an area that includes Australia, New Zealand, and the islands of the South, West, and Central Pacific. More than half the people in the global village come from the 10 most populated countries. 21 are from China, 17 are from India, 5 are from the United States, 4 are from Indonesia, 3 are from Brazil, 3 are from Pakistan, 2 are from Russia, 2 are from Bangladesh, 2 are from Japan, 2 are from Nigeria. What language do people of the global village speak? In the global village, there are almost 6,000 languages, but more than half of the people speak these 8 languages. 22 speak a Chinese dialect. Of these people, 18 speak Mandarin dialect. 9 speak English. 8 speak Hindi. 7 speak Spanish. 4 speak Arabic. 4 speak Bengali. 3 speak Portuguese. 3 speak Russian. If you could say hello in these 8 languages, you could greet well over half the people in the village. Is there enough food for all the people in the global village? There's no shortage of food in the global village. The villagers have many animals which help produce food or are a source of food. They are 31 sheep and goats, 23 cows, bulls, and oxen, 15 pigs, 3 camels, 2 horses, 189 chickens. There are nearly twice as many chickens as people in the global village. There is no shortage of food in the global village. If all the food were divided equally, everyone would have enough to eat. But food isn't divided equally. So although there's enough to feed all the villagers, not everyone is well fed. 60 people are always hungry, and 26 of these are severely malnourished. 16 other people go to bed hungry at least some of the time. Only 24 people always have enough to eat. Do all the villagers have access to fresh air and drinkable water? Fresh air and drinkable water are necessities. How many people in a village of 100 have clean air and a nearby source of clean water? 75 have access to a source of safe water, either in their homes or within a short distance. The other 25 do not. They must spend a large part of each day simply getting safe water. Most of the work of collecting water is done by women and girls. 68 breathe clean air, while 32 breathe air that is unhealthy because of pollution. How many people in a village of 100 go to school? There are 38 school-aged villagers, age 5 to 24, but only 31 of the 38 attend school. There's one teacher for these students. Not everyone in the global village is encouraged to read, write, and think. Of the 88 people old enough to read, 71 can read at least a little, but 17 cannot read at all. Most males are taught to read than females. How much money do people in the global village have? If all the money in the village were divided equally, each person would have about $6,200 per year. But in the global village, money isn't divided equally. The richest 20 people each have more than $9,000 a year. The poorest 20 people each have less than $1 per day. The other 60 people have something in between. The average cost of food, shelter, and other necessities in the village is $4,000 to $5,000 per year. Many people don't have enough money to meet these basic needs. What will our village be like in the future? How fast will it grow? What will it be home to? Today, the village of 100 people is growing at a rate of slightly less than 2 people per year. If there are 100 people in 2002, there will be almost 102 in 2003. In 2050, there will be nearly 200 people. In 2100, there will be nearly 400 people. In 2150, there will be nearly 800 people. In 2200, there will be nearly 1,600 people. In 2250, there will be nearly 3,300 people. In the past, it took 3,000 years for the population to double 5 times. In the future, the population will double 5 times in just 250 years. Not everyone agrees the village will grow this fast. Many groups, such as United Nations, are working hard to make sure the village of the future is a good home for all the people who live in it. Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce Anthony Stevenson, principal of the Radnor Middle School, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Morning. So when I was thinking about what to say, if you know anything about me, I have a love-hate relationship with the high school principal, Mark Skellinger. And because he thinks that his high school is the best school in Radnor, and he is the best high school in Radnor. However, we're the best school in Radnor. And so when I was thinking about introducing Dr. Tyler, I thought about it a month ago, about a couple of things. And so Mark Skellinger, he went to a homegoing celebration service for his former secretary. It was a wonderful Ruth Bowers. And it was at a black church. And I told Mark, I gave him a couple of rules. I said, get there early, because it's a small church, it fills up fast, and pack a lunch, because they're going to have church. And of course, Mark doesn't pay me attention. He does his own thing. He got there a little late, and they marched him up and sat him in front. And at the end, about 3 hours later, Mark said, his text was, what an experience. And I said that because our speaker, if you have ever been to Mother Bethel AME Church or anywhere else and heard Mark Kelly Tyler, it is an experience. It's an experience because of his talents, it's an experience because of his knowledge, and it's an experience because of his passion for the Word of God, but also his passion for helping his fellow man. Reverend Tyler, I know him not only from what you can read on his biography about his vast educational background, his vast experiences in the work he does, but I know him because I worked under him at Mother Bethel for a few years, and I know his passion for what he believes in. And as he is about to come up, I just want to let him know that we're on the main line, and we have to be out of here by 9 o'clock. So I know this brother can hoop. You folks know what I mean. You folks know what I say. He got a hoop, all right? And he can go. And I hope he don't take out that towel, because I got to get out of here at 9 o'clock. And so when he starts going, he's going to put us in the, so when he starts speaking, sometimes, in the black church, you get caught, get caught in the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit hits you. We're hoping that he just let the Holy Spirit tap us this morning so we can get out of here in time. But it is my pleasure to introduce a great man, a man that is appropriate for this breakfast, the Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to certainly thank Principal Stevenson for that kind introduction. And having served on the staff at Mother Bethel Church, there were a lot of things that he could have said, and I'm just appreciative that he did not say them this morning. Now, I want to thank the Planning Committee for the invitation, and there are so many people that I would like to recognize, but I've already been told that I don't have much time. And so, excuse me, let me just simply acknowledge all of you for your attendance. Certainly the persons who put this breakfast together are to be commended. I see in the audience colleagues who are AME and other clergy colleagues who have had a chance to meet preaching here on the main line several times. I see former members from Westchester and current members from Mother Bethel, government and elected officials, choir, and all of you, even the program participants. Certainly want to thank the person who just read that reading just a moment ago, because I think it is helpful for what I want to share. Now, glad that I found a little bit more detail about the breakfast on the website and the wonderful write-up that was done on it, because it's helped me kind of understand where to go. And I wanted to share with you for a moment and frame my remarks around Genesis chapter 45. And though I'm using a biblical text, I promise you this is not a sermon. Somebody said amen. 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 But I think that it's helpful for us this morning as we think about the work of undoing racism. Genesis 45, you find these words. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." And then in verse 14, then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. And if I had to put a title on this talk, it would simply be, "Didn't you know that I'm your brother?" Didn't you know that I'm your brother? And I'm certain that Richard Allen would be pleased to know that a breakfast dedicated to dismantling racism was the outcome of the dedication of a park in his name 250 years after his birth. When Bishop Allen preached in Radnor as a young 20-something in the mid-1780s, he found a world that was vastly different than the one that he grew up in on a Delaware slave plantation. In fact, if you read his autobiography carefully, the experience here in his early ministry was one of the highlights for him. When Allen preached in Radnor and on the main line, you'd be amazed to know that the congregation looked very much like the room today. He didn't just preach to those of his own kind, but he preached to a mixed congregation of blacks and whites. And some might find that a surprising thing to hear for America in the 1780s when slavery was still so entrenched in our world. But one of the marks of the great revival period known as the Great Awakening was the fact that it often tore down barriers of race and class. In those days, in the Great Awakening, it was not unusual to hear of enslaved persons preaching to white persons, even oftentimes preaching to and converting their own slave masters. The owners were not in worship to simply monitor to make sure slaves were not planning an uprising, but they were there because they came as worshipers. And these religious meetings were often so powerful that issues of race and class and station in life and even gender became secondary to the demands of the gospel. Imagine how hopeful Richard Allen must have been in those days when he visited this place. The war was over and the new nation was on the horizon, and people were calling for the formation of a government where all persons would be treated as equals. Imagine how hopeful Allen must have been to know that the framers of the Constitution had in view a nation that was governed by the people and for the people. Imagine how hopeful Allen must have been during those years as he witnessed the transformative power of religion and the tearing down of walls of difference. Yet the world that Allen hoped for and dreamed of would be delayed for a while because of a lack of political courage by America's founding fathers. There was something happening in America on the political scene, and on the political front outside the four walls of the church that would deeply impact Allen's life inside the four walls of the church. David Wills, a scholar in the history of the church in America, talks about a phenomenon that he has labeled the gap between black and white. And what David Wills simply says is that in repeated moments of American history, there have been times where events have happened where the gap between us has closed and almost gone away. And yet every time the gap comes together, something happens and explodes and the gap becomes wider. At the end of the Civil War, where it seemed in Reconstruction that the gap would close, soon it went the other direction. During the ecumenical church movement in the early 1900s, it seemed that the gap would close, and then soon it went the other direction. Some would even say that the civil rights movement in America seemed to be one of those moments that would end with the gap closing, and then it went the other way. You don't have to go that far back. Just in 2008, after the election of America's first black president, many people thought that it was a sign that the gap was closing finally, and yet after a few weeks in office, we recognize that the gap is difficult to close. And in Richard Allen's day, it seemed also that the gap would close. Think about it. Richard Allen preaching on the main line to a mixed congregation in the 1780s. The gap had to close. In fact, Allen did so well on the main line that he was called up to the majors in Philadelphia. The preacher at St. George's invited him to come preach on his staff and build up that congregation, and Allen must have thought that the world of slavery was soon coming to an end. When he began preaching in 1786, worship at St. George's looked much like it did on the main line. Blacks and whites worshiping together side by side. But over the next year, from 1786 to 1787, new rules began to emerge as black attendance at St. George's began to grow. Allen was good at what he did, and the crowd showed up, and those who were once welcomed worshipers were then told, you have to worship on the side. When that wasn't good enough, they were then told you got to worship in the back. Then they helped to build and expand the church by putting in a balcony, and were told at the end of the construction that the balcony was for you. Imagine the irony of sitting in a balcony that you helped pay for. It must have been like fighting for a nation to be free and then told that you must remain a slave in the new free nation. By 1787, the new concept of a segregated pew had become a staple not just at St. George's, but in American Protestant churches all over the nation, regardless of whether they were in the North or in the South. How painful it must have been for those early Methodists and Baptists and others who remembered years before worshiping in places like this where race was not a consideration, and now it seemed that the clock had been turned backwards. What could have possibly happened to make such sudden changes in a place that was once so open and free? What happened to expand the gap instead of close the gap between black and white? Let me suggest to you that right under Richard Allen's nose, that as he preached his heart out about a God who loves everyone, whether yellow, black, or white, we're all precious in his sight. That right there, 1 mile away from St. George's at Independence Hall, people were talking about doing everything with the exception of giving independence to everyone. That at the same time that Allen was preaching at St. George's, the framers of the Constitution were trying to negotiate a deal to keep America as a union. And in a grand bargain and a dastardly act of compromise, America's black population was sold down the river, thereby widening the gap in a way that forever since we've been trying to close. A compromise, by the way, that would come back and bite the nation less than 100 years later in the Civil War, showing that you can't make a deal and compromise with that which is evil and win. The decision to allow slavery to continue for the sake of the Union said to Allen and to others that you can haul salt for the Continental Army during a Revolutionary War, but you can't be counted as a citizen when the war is over. It said to James Fortin that you can fight for the cause, but you can't vote for causes that are important to you. It said to Crispus Attucks that you can die for the nation, but your descendants will not be viewed as full human beings once freedom has been secured. It was a difficult time for Allen and for others, but I would imagine that the most difficult and trying thing for Allen was not all of the other things that went by, but the fact that he was no longer considered a brother. Think about it. The impact for Allen's world inside the four walls of the church meant that the place he once knew, a place of inclusion, a place of togetherness, a place of brotherhood and sisterhood, was slipping away as the church took on the ways of the world around him. The church forgot the mandate that the church was not called to be conformed to the world, but that the church was called to transform itself and thereby transform the world around it. The church ceased to be a thermostat changing the temperature and simply became a thermometer telling people how hot and how cold it was around them. What would America look like today if people of faith in the 1700s would have stood up and said that we don't want a nation that makes compromises on the backs of others? What would our nation look like today if people of faith had the guts to stand up and do then that which was right? There were certainly a few who tried, but there were not enough. There might be a word for us today as we witness the assault on the weakest of those in our society. Even today, we have persons who cry out about trying to make ends meet when all they have left after they pay their bills is $400,000, when those who work for them in places like Subway have to try to figure out how to make ends meet when their net profit at the end of the year is $400 and they've got 3 or 4 children to spread it around. The emotions that must have plagued Richard Allen for the rest of his remarkable life must have been difficult to deal with. And I don't want you to feel sorry for Richard Allen because, he went on about his business and did what he was called to do. He went on to found Mother Bethel Church and went on to found the first African-American denomination, the AME Church. He was a hero in the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. He was a person who was an entrepreneur, even counting George Washington's White House as one of his customers for his cleaning business of chimneys. Don't feel too bad for Richard Allen. But I know that there must have been something nagging Richard Allen all of his life. The fact that even with all of his accomplishments, that for those around him, that there was always someone who would look at him and think that they could determine who he was simply by what was on the outside. Can I suggest to you that Richard Allen is not so different than Joseph? And that in the Bible we find Joseph, who, like Richard Allen, found himself spending his young years as a slave to someone else. That like Richard Allen, he was still in a position where he found favor upon his life, and he was able to come up out of slavery and out of bondage and even out of the penitentiary to rise to one of the highest positions in all the land. Joseph, like Allen, experienced God's unique favor in a place where he should not have received it. And now Joseph sat as the second in command over all of Egypt, the world's most powerful nation. Now, Joseph was sold into bondage by his own flesh and blood. His own big brother sold him there. And you know, if you don't know this yet, God has a funny sense of humor. That those who do you wrong one day might often find themselves at your doorstep, and the answer to what they need is in your hand. Imagine Joseph's surprise in the midst of this great famine that infected not only Egypt, but all of the known world, where Joseph, because of his interpretation of dreams, was able to save Egypt and store up enough grain that others from other nations could come and buy food in the time of the famine. Imagine his surprise when he walked out one day and there stood a ragtag group of young men looking to buy some bread, and they were the same brothers who sold him into slavery years before. Joseph may have felt like the Count of Monte Cristo, who probably in his own time couldn't wait to see the people who sold him out so he could exact vengeance upon them. And when Joseph saw them, though he was waiting for a response from them when they saw him, his own brothers who sold him as a slave did not even recognize who Joseph was. More painful than being sold into bondage. More painful than all of the years in Potiphar's house and in the penitentiary must have been the fact that now he stood in front of those who had the same father, and they could not recognize him for who he was. And I'd argue with you that even more painful than all of the things that people have to go through in life, it is the fact that someone can stand in front of you and not recognize that you're their brother, that you are their sister, that we are called from a common parent. As the sister said, that what if the world was a village? There were only 100 people. It would be a lot easier to tell that we are all together. And what Joseph had to do to get his brothers to recognize who he was is that Joseph had to begin undoing all of the Egyptian stuff. They didn't know who he was because of the things that were on the outside, the Egyptian headdress and the Egyptian makeup that he wore, and the Egyptian language and the Egyptian clothes and the Egyptian walk that he had. And it was all of the things on the outside that prevented them from seeing that it was their brother. That's one of the things that prevents us from undoing the racism, because it's difficult to undo all of the stuff that we put on in our lives, all of the things that make us other than someone else, all of the things that we've invested in to build up walls to show how we're different than you and you're different from me. We like being red states and blue states. It's easy to put people in compartments. We like being Republicans or Democrats. We like being unions or union busters. We like being Palestinians or Israelis. We like all of the difference. But if you want to know who the other is, it means that you've got to go through the process like Joseph did, taking off the stuff, taking off the layers, looking one another in the eye, and reminding each other that even though we've got all of these walls built up, you're my brother. Yes. You're my sister. It's not the main line versus the city. It's not urban and suburban or rural, but it's all of us in one village. Someone has asked me once before, and I'm sure my fellow Methodist historian out there, the good Reverend I was sitting with, will attest to this, that someone asked me, why would Richard Allen remain a Methodist after the way he was treated at St. George's? Segregated in a church he helped to build for 30 years after he left, dogged by those who kept trying to take his church from him. His church was taken and sold in a sheriff's sale. He had to buy it back for $10,000. Finally took an act of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to totally set him free from their control. And someone said, why would he become like Absalom Jones and just become an Episcopalian? Or like others and just go another way? How could he remain loyal to the Methodists? But it was because Allen understood that the folk who were treating him bad were not acting like Methodists. He remembered John Wesley, who on his dying deathbed, in his last act in England, when he could have been writing a letter to loved ones and telling his family how much he cared for them, chose to use the last strength he had to write a letter to William Wilberforce, a legislator in England, and said, do whatever you can to help stop slavery in England and the rest of the world. Allen remained a Methodist because he knew that even though people weren't acting like brothers and sisters, even though people forgot that they were brothers and sisters, that God still called them, and that it wasn't Methodism that was wrong, but it was those of us who had forgotten how to love one another. How do you undo racism? You remember that we're brothers and we're sisters. God bless you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Reverend Tyler. It was really wonderful, very inspiring and informative, just what we really needed this morning. I wanted to let everyone know I gave Reverend Tyler an envelope with a check in it. It's a very small honorarium, but the thing that's very important about that honorarium is that because we all came together for breakfast and we paid a little bit more than the very good price that Villanova gave us for the breakfast, everybody contributed a small amount to that honorarium. So I just wanted to let you all know that you were a part of that. I just wanted to acknowledge the presence of one other distinguished guest, Reverend Albert Davis, who is the president of the mainline NAACP. So thank you for coming. We're just going to have one more song, I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing, by the Unity Choir. And then we'll have the benediction and just one hospitality note, and then we'll be finished for today.
Please join us.
I think I'll give you the hospitality notes first so that we can end with the benediction. On your program on the back, where it says the community breakfast, just below that is an email address, thecommunitybreakfast@comcast.net. And if you email that address saying that you would like to have more information about next year's breakfast, I will be able to have your email address and be able to be in touch with you for that. And then the other very important note is that we all parked in the upper parking lot of the St. Augustine Center on the upper level. You have to turn left when you exit that parking lot to come back to the Eisen gate. You can't go the other way, so a left turn there. Thank you all very much for coming. I'd like to introduce Senior Pastor Joseph DiPaolo from Wayne United Methodist Church, who will give us the benediction. Thank you.
And I would just like to acknowledge all the hard work. Ann Benicosi has really been the driving spirit behind the driving of this project. Hopefully you have been fed not only in your body, but by your spirit, and give you inspiration to go out and to fulfill that charge that we've already heard, to serve our sisters and brothers wherever we may find them. I'd like to close with the classic blessing from the Hebrew Scriptures. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen.